My next guest today is Sanjay Huprikar. He's president of IPC in Europe and South Asia. Great to see you, Sanjay.
Likewise, great to see you as well. Thank you for inviting me.
Right. So lots of things happening over there in Europe and South Asia.
Absolutely.
What do you, on your overall remit, I mean, what do you see as your biggest opportunities and your biggest challenges over there?
Yeah. So I think the biggest challenge is the PCB industry is the biggest challenge right now in Europe. Everyone knows the numbers. We've lost 90% plus of that industry. And it's beginning to have a real impact on some very core verticals like aerospace, military and defense. So with that challenge comes the opportunity, which is the European Union has focused on competitiveness and security as two of their biggest themes for the next 5 years.
Yes.
Electronics manufacturing can play a big role in both of those areas.
Absolutely.
And so I think that is the area that we are fighting for on behalf of our membership, on behalf of our industry, is that this might be the opportunity to get PCB back on the radar.
Right.
In so many ways, the CHIPS Act was a wonderful thing for electronics. It proved that with the right messaging, that government would be engaged in private enterprise and look for opportunities to fund. Yeah. Now we can argue about whether the funding mechanisms were right. Did the right people get the funding? Everyone has an opinion on that. But it showed that it can be done.
Right.
And I think if we, as a trade association representing the PCB industry, one of the constituents that we represent, obviously we represent more than that, there is a tremendous opportunity for us to use perhaps the geopolitics of today, the increased spending in defense that we're going to see across the EU and in the UK, and position PCB to be one of those important, innovative technologies that needs to be incorporated for supply chain resilience issues, for autonomy, for security.
Right. Well, I mean, they did recently announce was an $850 billion program to build defense capability within Europe. Obviously, a lot of that's going to go towards electronics that will be involved in all these systems, and it's very important. PCB, critical part of that, as we were talking before we came on camera. When I started in this industry, we had over 400 PCB shops
just in the UK alone. Correct.
And now it's
15.
Yeah. So it definitely needs bolstering. There are a couple of issues with it, of course, because it's a chemical process. Some of these chemistries aren't particularly nice.
That's true.
Friendly, and it needs to support industries that go behind it.
That's right.
So I think Europe, which is very environmentally driven, needs to sort of find ways and solutions to be able to allow that to happen.
I think the way we position that conversation is that the funding needs to be there for capacity, the funding needs to be there for capability, and the funding needs to be there for innovation. They all go hand in hand. You're right. Some of the processes are dirty.
Right.
But with funding for innovation, you can clean up some of those processes. And I think there's pathways to do that.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing that seems to be lacking a little bit and needing more capacity, and I think is OSATs in Europe as well. There's not quite as many as might be needed.
The only one that comes to mind readily off the top of my head is Amcor in Portugal.
Yes.
I mean, I'm sure there are more, but that's the only one that sticks in my head.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, another area that you're responsible for, which of course is South Asia, and let's look at India by comparison.
Yeah.
They're doing a very good job of pulling in the PCB companies from China, and they're opening OSATs at a heck of a rate.
Well, we talked about this before we started filming, which is they're probably the best example in the world right now of an end-to-end supply chain resiliency.
Right.
They see the gaps, they see the opportunities, and they have a government that's willing to partner with private enterprise to see some of this through. So I hesitate to use the word poster child, but if there's any country that's seemingly doing it right, that's probably the country we should be looking at right now.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they've still got to do some work on their infrastructure, but I mean,
absolutely.
But they've certainly got it right in terms of supporting industry.
Correct.
I think that's true. I mean, some countries are good at building certain things and have their own specialism. So what's your view looking around South Asia, about, for example, Thailand?
So Thailand could potentially be the next hub of PCB,
Yes.
is my read.
Right.
Whereas Malaysia has always kind of been that back-end expert, I see Thailand being kind of that PCB
Yes.
expert. And I think there's already evidence to suggest that they've embraced that. We see investment in Thailand for PCB growth and fab. We see China and Taiwan moving some of their operations and facilities to Thailand.
Yes.
So I think that's where Thailand's role is going to be, is probably the next PCB.
Right, right. Now, as companies develop their China Plus One, initiatives, a lot of the manufacturing moved out to places like Philippines and Vietnam. But now people are saying, well, Vietnam is very good, but it's got a very highly educated workforce, but it's the labor rate's rising to the point that it's starting to price itself out of the market a little bit.
Correct.
What is your take on it?
The reason the industry first went to China was because of labor rates.
Right.
And then China's labor rates went up. And that industry started moving further into places like Thailand and Vietnam.
Yeah.
And as you've pointed out, compared to where Vietnam and labor rates were 10 years ago, those rates have gone up. So is there a next frontier? And within Southeast Asia, perhaps Indonesia could be that next frontier. Their labor rate is not as high as Vietnam's today. I think it's going to be Africa is where people are going to end up. We're already seeing evidence of EMS growth in Africa, across Morocco and Tunisia as an example. IPC is engaged in some programs that are right now occurring in places like Egypt and in South Africa. If you move a little bit east into the Middle East, we're seeing things happening in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates. So there will always be a next frontier, and I think Africa and Middle East is going to play a role in that, maybe 10 years down the road.
I think the only really unexploited continent in terms of electronics is Africa. So that's really interesting to hear.
So we, as it's interesting, sometimes when you're a standards development organization, which has been one of our cores, that tends to be kind of a rear view facing exercise, right? Right. But here's an area where we are anticipating where the market could potentially move, and we're looking to make investments in those areas. Small ones to start with, but we're seeing some evidence that there's going to be some growth in those areas.
Right, interesting.
And that's exciting.
Okay, it is, yeah. So, right across the industry, globally, we're having issues with labor shortages.
Yes.
And training.
Correct.
What sort of initiatives is IPC doing in Europe and South Asia, to help engineers and operators to qualify?
So the biggest aha learning moment for us is that we can't do it alone. Developing training programs and skilling programs in any country outside of the United States requires partnerships and alliances.
Yeah.
There's always funding mechanisms engaged and involved in that as well, so we have to find the right players there. So we are always looking at existing training organizations, existing training facilities, subject matter experts, and then individuals within government that are very locked in to wanting to make sure their people get trained. And that's a complex recipe.
Yes.
And it's not a one-size-fits-all recipe from country to country. So we are very much hand-to-hand tactical combat, if I can use that phrase. Malaysia, we're working on a project right now in Malaysia to get training programs developed for that workforce.
That's the yeah.
What we do in Malaysia, we're not going to be able to duplicate in other countries because every country is unique that way. So Malaysia is a good example where we're working with NGOs, government opportunities, private companies to come up with the right combination there.
Right.
I think we'll see a breakthrough there probably in the next 9 to 12 months.
Okay, interesting. And then obviously in the back of all that, you've got the IPC standards, which are globally recognized and around the world. But I mean, you mentioned something to me earlier about that standards can emanate from anywhere.
Correct.
Because some countries have got certain specialisms in certain industries.
Right.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, we talked earlier about one of the most interesting. So let me back up a step. One of the things we do, we take the word global seriously, and what we mean by that is we don't dictate where the standard needs to originate from. If a group of companies within a certain geography have expertise in a certain area, by all means, they should have the ability to kick off a standards development activity there.
Right.
So a great example of that is China, where we kicked off our very first standards activity in China was in rail, because the Chinese have become experts in the rail industry.
Right.
And after they got that project kicked off, word leaked out to folks in the UK and France that, hey, there's a rail standard going on. Well, we should be part of that.
Right.
Now, you're probably not going to find too many Americans who are on that particular standard, because rail is not necessarily a core expertise in the US, right?
Yes.
But it's a great example of not only
there was a need,
and it didn't matter which geography it came from, and once word got out to other geographies who had expertise in that area, they wanted to dive in and be part of that as well.
Right.
That is the epitome of a global standards organization.
True collaboration.
True collaboration, global, no barriers.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it's an exciting landscape at the moment, that's for sure.
Definitely.
And you've certainly got a lot of work ahead of you, Sanjay, and
we're excited to do the work.
Yep, and we're excited to help you and support you where we can. So I want
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in and telling us about it today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Video proudly sponsored by Kyoyoung Technology. True 3D inspection for the SMT industry.